What if the fate of kingdoms could swing in a single summer, a single battle, a single choice between freedom and fear? In our last journey through echoes of time, we witness the fall of the Ming dynasty, the lonely death of its last emperor, the treachery of Shanhai Pass, the famine that starved a nation, and the comet that blazed as empires trembled. Across the seas, Cromwell's Ironsides rode to glory at Marston Moor, while in Germany, the hills of Freiburg drank the blood of thousands. 1644 had already shown us how fragile power could be. But the story does not end there. In this chapter, we remain in 1644 and turn to a kingdom fractured by civil war. We will stand on the battlefield of Cheriton, watch York surrender, and march with Essex into the trap at Lostwithiel before ending in the stalemate of Newbury. Yet war is only half the story. Beyond the clash of swords, Matthew Hopkins spreads terror as Witchfinder General, while across the ocean, Rhode Island's charter proclaims freedom of conscience. In Rome, a new pope rises to the throne of St. Peter, while in London, John Milton lifts his pen to defend liberty of thought. Stay with us as we unravel a year where war tested nations, witch hunts tested fear, and new voices tested the meaning of freedom itself. Like this video, subscribe to Echoes of Time, and if you wish to keep history breathing, consider a small donation. The English Civil War had already raged for nearly 2 years when the fields of Hampshire became its stage. On the morning of March 29, 1644, near the small village of Cheriton, two armies faced each other across hedgerows and farmland. To the Royalists, victory meant breaking Parliament's grip on southern England. To Parliament, defeat here could open the road to London. The numbers tell us how evenly matched the sides were. Sir William Waller and Sir William Balfour commanded close to 12,000 parliamentarian troops, bolstered by cavalry and local militia. Facing them, the Royalists under Lord Hopton and the Earl of Forth had a similar force, around 11 to 12,000 men. Both armies knew the stakes. Both armies knew this was not a skirmish, but a battle that could turn the balance of war. The fight began in confusion. A Royalist advance, poorly coordinated, stumbled into a parliamentarian ambush. Muskets cracked across the hedgerows, and cavalry charges dissolved in the narrow lanes. Eyewitnesses wrote that the smoke did hang so thick upon the field, one might scarce discern friend from foe. Yet the discipline of Parliament's infantry held firm, their lines braced with pikes and supported by field artillery. As the day wore on, the Royalists attempted to seize high ground near Cheriton Wood. For a moment, their Cornish infantry pressed forward with ferocity, but Waller counterattacked with a surge of cavalry, scattering the Royalist flank. Panic spread. Once the flank folded, the Royalist centre wavered, then broke. The losses were staggering. Estimates suggest that over 1,000 Royalists were killed or captured, along with several senior officers. Parliament lost far fewer, though their victory was not without blood. Survivors recalled the fields, strewn with horse and man, together like sheaves upon the harvest ground. The aftermath was decisive. The Royalist plan to push into the south collapsed. Hopton's army, shaken and weakened, withdrew. For King Charles, the defeat at Cheriton was a bitter blow. In the months to come, it would limit his ability to threaten London and allow Parliament to regroup for future offensives. But beyond the strategy, the battle carried symbolic weight. Parliament's victory proved that the Royalist tide could be checked, that the King's cause was not unstoppable. Letters from London describe bells ringing, crowds cheering, and pamphlets hailing Cheriton as a sign that God favoured Parliament's side. And yet, for the common people of Hampshire, there was little glory. Their fields were trampled, their hedges burned, their barns looted by soldiers of both armies. A local chronicler wrote simply, "We had no harvest that year, for our corn was trodden underfoot." Cheriton was not as famous as Marston Moor or Naseby, but in 1644 it mattered deeply. It was the battle that broke the royalist dream of sweeping through the south and showed that Parliament's armies, though often divided by politics, could hold together under fire. It was also a reminder of how swiftly fortune could turn. For even as Parliament celebrated in spring, by the summer the war would swing back toward the king. But for this moment, on a muddy Hampshire field, Parliament held the day. Only 3 months after Cheriton, the struggle for England's north reached its climax outside the walls of York. This was no village skirmish. York was the greatest city of the north, the seat of royalist power in the region, defended by stout medieval walls and a determined garrison. To hold York was to hold the gateway to Scotland and the north of England. To lose it was to concede the crown's authority in half the kingdom. Since April 1644, York had been under siege by a combined army of parliamentarians and their Scottish allies of the Covenant. Together, they fielded almost 30,000 men, tightening the noose around a city defended by fewer than 6,000 royalists. Food grew scarce. Chronicles tell us that citizens boiled horseflesh and even dogs to keep hunger at bay. Yet the garrison, under the Marquess of Newcastle and Lord Bellasis, refused to surrender. On July 2nd, Prince Rupert arrived at the head of a relief force, confident in his cavalry's reputation. What followed was the Battle of Marston Moor, the storm that shattered the king's northern army. Rupert's defeat left York isolated, cut off from hope. 2 weeks later, on July 16th, the city capitulated. Negotiations spared the defenders' lives, but the surrender was humiliating. 5,000 royalist soldiers marched out of York with their weapons shouldered, only to lay them down before Parliament's banners. Their commanders departed in exile. The city gates were handed over and the keys delivered to the Earl of Manchester. One pamphlet from London exulted, "York is rendered. The north is now the Parliament's." For Charles I, the loss was devastating. The royalist cause in the north was broken, its strongholds collapsing one by one. No longer could the king count on northern levies or Scottish support. For the people of York, the moment was bittersweet. The siege had brought months of hardship, hunger, disease, and the constant fear of bombardment. Yet the city was spared a sack. Unlike so many towns in Europe's wars, York's walls were not pulled down, its churches not desecrated. Still, the scars remained in the empty cupboards and graves of those who had starved. The fall of York was more than a military defeat. It was a turning point in the Civil War. It proved that the king could not hold the north, that Parliament and the Scots together could achieve what neither might have alone. The balance of the war shifted, and from this point forward, Charles fought not to win, but to survive. And yet, as Parliament's armies celebrated, the wheel of fortune was already turning again. In the far west, King Charles himself was preparing, a counterstroke that would humiliate Parliament before the year was done. If York was the breaking of the king's power in the north, then Lostwithiel was his triumph in the west. After Parliament's victories at Marston Moor and Cheriton, many believed the war was turning decisively against Charles. But in the late Tudor summer of 1644, fortune favoured the crown once more. The Earl of Essex, Parliament's seasoned general, led an army of nearly 10,000 men deep into royalist-held Cornwall. His orders were ambitious: to bring the West firmly under Parliament's new control. At first, the campaign seemed promising. Towns opened their gates and Essex pressed boldly south. Yet he had marched too far, with the sea at his back and the king's army closing in from all sides. By August, Charles Vance himself, commanding in person, had trapped Essex in the narrow valleys around the small town of Lostwithiel. The Royalist. Net tightened. Supplies ran out. Disease crept through the parliamentarian camp. A soldier's letter lamented, "Our bellies are empty, our powder is spent, and our hope is fled." Essex realized his army could not hold. In desperation, he slipped away by boat with a few officers, leaving the rest to their fate. On September 2nd, Parliament's infantry surrendered. Nearly 10,000 men laid down their arms, their artillery, and their baggage. Only the cavalry, led by Sir William Balfour, managed to cut their way out in a daring night escape. For Parliament, it was a catastrophe. An entire field army lost, its weapons captured, its men scattered. For Charles, it was his greatest victory of the war. Royalist banners flew proudly over Cornwall, and morale soared. One royalist chronicler gloated, "The rebels were utterly disgraced, their pride brought low." Yet even in triumph, shadows lingered. The king could not pursue his victory far. His resources were thin, his treasury drained. And though Lostwithiel restored his honor, it did not restore the north, already gone with the fall of York. Still, the contrast was stark. Within weeks of losing his northern army, Charles had shattered one of Parliament's southern ones. The war had become a pendulum, swinging violently between disaster and triumph, victory and defeat. For the men who surrendered at Lostwithiel, the memory was bitter. Many trudged home in shame, mocked by their enemies. Some deserted altogether, unwilling to fight again. The parliamentarian cause survived, but the blow was deep. In London, news of the defeat sent shockwaves through Parliament. Pamphlets raged at Essex's failure. Critics whispered that he had fled like a coward, abandoning his men. Supporters argued he had been betrayed by fortune. Either way, the loss helped push Parliament toward reform, the creation of a new, more disciplined force that would fight not as scattered armies under divided generals, but as one united new model army. Lostwithiel was more than a royalist victory. It was the last great triumph of Charles I, a fleeting moment when the crown still seemed capable of restoring its power. But it was also a mirror of the Civil War itself, a struggle of missteps and reversals where no victory lasted long. The autumn of 1644 brought both sides of the English Civil War once more into collision. Parliament had endured humiliation at Lostwithiel, yet still fielded formidable strength. King Charles, fresh from victory in Cornwall, sought to march east and relieve pressure on Oxford, his wartime capital. On October 27th, near the town of Newbury in Berkshire, the two sides met in a clash that would reveal not only the brutality of war, but the poison of division. Parliament had assembled three armies under the Earl of Manchester, the Earl of Essex, and Sir William Waller. Together, they outnumbered the Royalists, perhaps 25,000 men against the King's 15,000. On paper, it should have been a crushing parliamentarian victory. Yet the generals mistrusted one another, their rivalries simmering, even on the eve of battle. The fighting raged across fields and hedgerows as dawn gave way to midday. Royalist artillery thundered, cavalry skirmished along the flanks, and infantry clashed in the centre. At one point, parliamentarian troops stormed Shaw House, a manor held by the King's men, only to be beaten back in bloody confusion. The fighting was fierce, with heavy losses on both sides. Contemporary accounts speak of bodies piled in ditches, the blood running in channels down the lanes. But as evening fell, the advantage slipped from Parliament's grasp. Disputes among its commanders delayed fresh assaults. Essex urged caution, Manchester hesitated, and Waller fumed. The king, seizing his chance, slipped away under cover of darkness, withdrawing his army intact. His artillery, baggage, and honor were saved. The numbers tell the cost. Each side lost perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 men. Grim testimony to the ferocity of the struggle. Yet no ground was gained, no decisive blow struck. Parliament, with superior numbers, had failed to destroy the king. Observers were furious. One pamphlet thundered, "We had victory in our hands, and by our own folly we cast it away." Within Parliament itself, tempers boiled. Oliver Cromwell, who had distinguished himself at Marston Moor earlier that year, openly criticized the half-heartedness of his superiors. He declared that never again should command be left to grandees who lacked the will to finish the fight. His words, sharpened by the bitterness of Newbury, sowed the seeds for the creation of the new model army in 1645, a professional force that would eventually break the king's cause forever. For King Charles, Newbury was no glorious triumph, but it was survival, and survival meant hope. In the corridors of Oxford, royalists celebrated that their king had once more escaped the jaws of defeat. For Parliament, it was a lesson written in blood. Numbers alone could not win wars, only unity of command and purpose could. The stalemate at Newbury captured the essence of 1644's Civil War, a year where victory and defeat danced together, and where even overwhelming force could be squandered by hesitation. The battlefield may have fallen silent, but the political storm it unleashed in London was only beginning. While armies clashed on the fields of Cheriton, York, Lostwithiel and Newbury, a different kind of battle spread across the villages of East Anglia. It was not fought with muskets and cannon, but with whispered accusations, sleepless nights, and ropes tied around the necks of women. In 1644, as the kingdom tore itself apart, a man named Matthew Hopkins rose to prominence. He called himself the Witchfinder General. Hopkins was the son of a Suffolk minister. By his early 30s, he lived quietly in Manningtree, a small town where fear of witches had long lingered in rumour. In the spring of 1644, as soldiers marched through the region and war disrupted ordinary life, he began to claim that witches were gathering in secret covens. His first accusation struck at a group of elderly women in Manningtree. He insisted they consorted with the devil and sent imps, small animal-like spirits, to torment their neighbours. The methods Hopkins employed were ruthless. He used sleep, deprivation, forcing the accused to sit for days without rest until they confessed. He searched their bodies for so-called witches' marks, moles or scars said to be the devil's seal. He even ordered that suspected witches be tied and thrown into ponds. If they floated, it proved guilt. If they sank, they were innocent, though many drowned before help could reach them. Pamphlets circulated about Hopkins' findings, filled with lurid tales of demonic pacts and midnight Sabbaths. Villagers, already shaken by war and hunger, were quick to believe. Within months, dozens were accused. Courts in Essex, Suffolk and Norfolk filled with trials. The women were often poor, widowed or disliked by their neighbours. Some were healers who had offered herbal remedies. Others were beggars who had quarrelled over food. Hopkins turned suspicion into evidence and gossip into death sentences. One account tells of a woman who cried out in court, declaring Hopkins himself was in league with the devil, for only a servant of darkness could accuse so many so easily. The judge silenced her, and she was hanged within days. Hopkins, unfazed, claimed he was doing God's work. By the end of 1644, his reputation had spread far beyond Manningtree. He was invited to towns across East Anglia, sometimes paid handsomely, by local officials eager to purge witches from their communities. Where he went, gallows followed. Estimates suggest that during the next few years, more than 100 people were executed as witches in England, most of them under Hopkins' influence. His rise shows another side of 1644. While generals fought for crowns and parliaments, ordinary villagers fought demons of their own making. In the shadow of civil war, Fear and superstition filled the silence of the night, and Matthew Hopkins made himself its prophet. Across the ocean, from England's battlefields and witch trials, a very different story unfolded in the colonies of New England. In 1644, the small settlement of Rhode Island received a charter that would make it unique among English possessions. It became the first place in the English-speaking world where the principle of complete freedom of conscience was written into law. The driving force behind this achievement was Roger Williams. Once a minister in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he had been banished in 1636 for what his Puritan neighbors called dangerous ideas. Williams argued that no government had the right to force a man's soul, that church and state must be separate, and that even those labeled heretics or infidels deserved liberty of belief. His words shocked the leaders of Massachusetts, who insisted their colony must remain pure and uniform in faith. Williams fled through the winter snows and survived with the help of the Narragansett people, with whom he built a rare relationship of trust. From them he purchased land, and there he founded Providence, a settlement that welcomed anyone, regardless of creed. Quakers, Baptists, Jews, and even those who professed no faith at all found refuge. By 1644, Williams had travelled back to England to secure protection for his colony. With Parliament's approval, Rhode Island was granted a charter that recognized its right to self-governance and, most radically, its guarantee of religious liberty. The words Williams used captured his vision. Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. To him, coerced belief was no faith at all. What mattered was the freedom to seek truth according to one's conscience. This was a revolutionary idea in an age when thousands died across Europe in wars of religion, and in England itself men and women were still being hanged as witches. The contrast is striking. In East Anglia, Matthew Hopkins hunted those accused of serving the devil, while across the Atlantic, Roger Williams insisted that faith could not be judged by man. One land tightened the rope, the other opened its doors. Rhode Island's charter did not make the colony rich or powerful, but it planted a seed. The principle that government must not dictate belief would echo centuries later in the American Constitution, shaping ideas of liberty across the world. In 1644, it stood as a fragile experiment on the edge of the wilderness, born out of exile and sustained by conviction. While kings and generals fought for thrones, Roger Williams fought for freedom of the soul. His victory, written on parchment in 1644, would outlast the battles of that year and become one of its most enduring legacies. While England bled and the New World experimented with liberty, another drama unfolded in the eternal city of Rome. In July of 1644, Pope Urban VIII died, leaving the chair of St. Peter vacant after a reign marked by splendor and controversy. His death opened the way for a conclave of cardinals that would stretch over weeks, watched closely by the monarchs of Europe. For the papacy in this age was not only a spiritual throne, but a prize of politics, courted by kings and empires alike. The conclave became a contest between French and Spanish influence. Urban VIII had favored France, enraging Spain, and so his death was seen as a chance for Madrid to restore its sway. After long debate and secret intrigue, the cardinals chose Cardinal Giovanni Battista Pamphili, who took the name Innocent X. He was 63 years old, a cautious man known for his legal mind rather than bold vision. When word spread, reactions revealed the papacy's entanglement with worldly affairs. A Venetian envoy wrote, "A pope made by the Spaniards, a disappointment to France." Yet, others hoped his moderation might bring balance to a continent weary of religious war. Innocent X inherited a church weary of the 30 Years' War and a city hungry for stability. Though his election did not end the fighting in Germany, it marked a subtle shift. The papacy, long a thunderous voice in Europe's conflicts, would in his hands speak more carefully, choosing caution over confrontation. The people of Rome greeted him with the usual pageantry, processions, and bells. Yet beneath the cheers lay murmurs. Some remembered Urban's lavish patronage of artists like Bernini and wondered if Innocent, more austere, would dim the city's brilliance. Others feared Spanish dominance would drag the church deeper into politics. In 1644, the papal throne passed quietly compared to the thunder of battle in England or the comet blazing over Asia. But its significance lay in what it revealed, that even in Rome, faith and power could not be separated. And as Innocent X lifted his hand to bless the crowd, Europe's rulers calculated how his reign might tilt the balance of their wars. In the same year that armies clashed at York and Lostwithiel, that witches swung from the gallows in East Anglia, and a new pope took the throne of Rome, one man in London lifted his pen against silence itself. His name was John Milton, a poet and scholar not yet famous for the epic he would one day write, but already burning with a fierce belief in liberty. In November 1644, Milton published a pamphlet called Areopagitica. Its title came from the Areopagus of ancient Athens, where citizens once debated in the open air. The pamphlet was his protest against Parliament's licensing order of 1643, which required every book or pamphlet to be approved by official censors before printing. Milton argued that such control strangled truth itself. "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience," he wrote, words that would echo long after muskets had fallen silent. To Milton, the clash of ideas was as vital as the clash of armies. He believed truth was not fragile but strong, and only through open contest could it shine. What makes his words more striking is the man behind them. Milton was no wild radical. He had studied in Cambridge, traveled in Italy, and met the great Galileo, then old and imprisoned for his writings. He returned to England convinced that suppressing thought was a greater crime than any political rebellion. He had already suffered. Personally, his own writings on divorce had been condemned, denied printing. Areopagitica was born from that wound, but it reached beyond his cause to embrace the freedom of all minds. The pamphlet was not read aloud in Parliament, and it changed no law at the time. Yet its ideas outlasted battles and kings. Centuries later, Areopagitica would be hailed as a foundation of free speech, influencing constitutions and declarations across the world. In 1644, Milton stood almost alone, a voice against the tide of censorship and fear. Yet his courage reminds us that freedom is not always won with swords. Sometimes it is won with words written in the quiet of a room, words that outlive the men who tried to silence them. 1644 was not only a year of battles and sieges, it was also a year when words, beliefs and fears carved their mark on history. On the fields of Cheriton and Marston Moor, Parliament gained the upper hand. At York, the king's northern stronghold fell, but at Lostwithiel, Charles struck back with unexpected fury. At Newbury, the war stalled, showing how division among generals could undo even the largest army. Beyond the clash of steel, other struggles raged. In the villages of East Anglia, Matthew Hopkins turned rumor into execution, filling gallows with the bodies of the accused. Across the Atlantic, Roger Williams secured Rhode Island's charter, planting the seed of liberty of conscience that would echo far beyond his own time. In Rome, a new pope rose to the throne of St. Peter, while in London, John Milton's words called for freedom of thought, words that would outlive every soldier of that year. The twist of 1644 is how one world hunted witches while another declared freedom of the soul, how one kingdom censored ideas while another gave birth to a defense of speech. History does not move in a single line. It pulls in opposite directions, forcing us to ask which path we will remember. Now I turn to you. Two events from 1644 remain hidden in our story. One involved a battle fought upon the sea between Denmark and Sweden, where smoke and fire engulfed ships in northern waters. The other concerned a princess in India whose palace burned, leading her to use her wealth to rebuild not only her home, but the lives of the poor. Can you name them? Leave your answers in the comments. Stay with us for the next episode of Echoes of Time, where the stage widens to the Atlantic and beyond, and the fate of empires is fought not only on land, but on the seas of trade and conquest. Like this video, subscribe, and if you wish to help keep history alive, consider supporting with a small donation.